on workforce planning. This is one of the extra bits in what we are calling Course X, and this is session 2, which is facilitating a workshop. It kind of fits in the WRaPT design process in the future state, but it is such a useful skill that it can apply almost anywhere. So I'm sure it will be an interesting course to run through. Before I start, I am Colin Lurie. I run a management training and development company. We focus on building skills in all sorts of areas, workforce planning being at the heart of a lot of them. I'll talk about the approach we use in a second, but we, as well as providing this free training, we also provide the WRaPT tool, along with our partners in Lancashire and South Cumbria NHS Foundation Trust, and in Health Education England. And the WRaPT tool is run by this bunch, including Fiona and Amina. They and we are an NHS-based training and development service commissioned by HEE and delivered with Lancashire and South Cumbria NHS Foundation Trust. We maintain the WRaPT tool, but what we also have is a set of training courses and approaches, one of which is WRaPT Redesign, which is the core course that this is linked to. I said I'd talk about how we develop people because we provide free tools and techniques like the WRaPT tool, and we provide this training online. But in reality, you need to bring some stuff to the workforce planning party. You need to bring your capacity and a basic capability to do this work. That capacity is time for training, time for practice, and access to coaching, so that you can test ideas and find out if what you're doing is right or not. So the training and align with that. You also need to bring a project to do this on, otherwise there's not much point in learning it. You need a reason to learn it, a chance to practice, and something to prove success, not just to yourself, but also to your organisation or to your system, because you're not going to give you the time to do this stuff if you're not doing something that's useful for somebody in power, somebody with their hands on the purse strings. So we'll bring the tools, you bring the rest of it, that'll be great. So why are we here? Well, as I say, we're in the WRaPT redesign course. We've got other courses on WRaPT modelling, on how to develop a workforce plan, developing a workforce hub, and the skills required for frontline workforce planning if you're a frontline manager. And this is part of the redesign part of that set of courses. These are the extra courses which cover those topics there. This one's facilitating a workshop. And we're going to cover everything from preparation to a workshop, agenda, the flow. We'll talk about the brainstorming, what we need there, the skills that are needed, the consensus building, how to deal with challenging behaviours, and what to do at the end of the workshop. The program is set out here. There are 5 steps to the main program: scope and mobilise, all the way through current state, future state, modelling and implementation. This one is one of the extra courses, X2, facilitating a workshop, which fits pretty much in the developing the future state, but you can also use it in understanding the current state, and you can use it in all sorts of other situations as well. So, facilitation. It's not just facilitating a workshop or a meeting or anything like that. If you first get involved in facilitation by turning up on the day, I would argue you're not facilitating. You are maitre d'-ing the day, or you are presenting on the day, or you are chairing the day. Whatever it is, you're not facilitating it, because facilitation starts with getting permission and it finishes with making sure that it has met its outcomes, or helping make sure it's met its outcomes. And that kind of helping and doing kind of thing is quite an interesting point here, because facilitation does not mean you take the accountability for the workshop meeting the objectives. You might take some of that responsibility on yourself, but you will not take it all. Your job is to be the best facilitator you can be for the group. And your job is to help the sponsors and the others to make sure they try and meet their objectives. But you can't take the responsibility for meeting the objectives completely. So it's important to make sure you have got your sponsor lined up. That sponsor, as we'll see later, will make sure we know what we're actually doing and what we're aiming to get out of this, and they will be accountable for making sure it succeeds with your help. And you need to align other support as well at this point. So you might be running the workshop, but who else in that workshop is going to help you deliver this? Who's going to support you? Who's going to help you with difficult, challenging behaviour? Who's going to help by providing information? Who's going to help by providing clarity at different points within it? Or possibly challenge, because if this workshop is about making sure that we save, well, let's say this workshop is about making sure that we are at least cost neutral in our change, and people are suggesting changes that are going to cost us an extra 10 million, then that sort of person will need to be in the room challenging that, not just you. So, covered that bit fairly extensively. What about engagement? Well, the next bit you do is once you've got permission and you've mobilized with people, you then need to find out who are the people that are going to be in that workshop, and you need to talk to them in advance if you can. At least a selection of them, if not all of them. It is good to do so. Why is it good to do so? Well, first of all, you learn a lot about the people that are going to be in that workshop, in those workshops, in that session. So you learn who's likely to be difficult, who's likely to be perhaps not difficult enough, what views have people got, who's going to need bringing out of themselves a bit, who might be out of themselves a bit too much. You will learn a lot about the people straight away. Secondly, they can tell you stuff that you can reflect back. So if you've done a survey to people, or if you've gone to meet them one-to-one and asked them some questions about what are the main issues, for example, that we face, well, then you've got that in advance, and you can flag it up on the screen right at the start. You've got some stuff that you can talk about straight away, which you've been easily able to collect and save some time in a workshop. So it's always good to be able to reflect back some stuff to people as part of the agenda. Finally, they get more comfortable with you, and they're more likely to listen to you in the session. So the more comfortable you, the better it's likely to be, assuming you're anyway like a reasonably nice person. And then you've got the session itself, the planning and preparation for that session, and the session itself, which I will cover in detail, so I'm not going to discuss it here. And then post the session, you've obviously got to make sure that you are handling the write-up, any further discussion, any further agreement or consensus building that needs to be had around stuff that's come out of those workshop or workshops, making sure that we have got, are helping the sponsor make sure that we have met the objective overall. So facilitation is, as it says there, not just the session. So I said I'd talk about preparation of the session in a bit more detail. So preparation, really covered by the table on the right-hand side. The rest of the slide talking about the who, but not the band, as in who's going to be there. The objectives is the first thing you need to consider. What do you want to get out of the workshop? Not what do you want to get out of it, what does the sponsor want to get out of it? We need to make sure we know that right up front, and we ought to be telling people in advance, because that should be part of the agenda, so that people know that and they know whether they're in the right room or not. Secondly, you need to plan for the session, including the breaks and the food, and build that into an agenda, which we'll cover in a second. But the important thing is to make sure there is an agenda so everyone knows what's going on, that appropriate breaks and appropriate food are provided. If you're taking people off site, if you're taking people out of their day and they're busy people, some sort of food is often a good thing. Obviously, when providing food, consider diversity. Who do we want there? I'll talk about that in a second, because that's quite a big section. From a roles point of view, okay, you're the facilitator, but there are lots of other roles that you might take. I probably should have a slide on this actually, but the roles could be, you've got presenters, yeah. So those are people that are going to be presenting. You might have table facilitators. So table facilitators are those people that sit on the on each table and make sure that the objectives are met in any exercises that table is doing on their own. You might have people scribing. You might have people being the maitre d' for the day. Making sure that we're on time. So you might have a timekeeper. There's all sorts of different things. You can be a facilitator and theoretically not say anything in a workshop. And I generally talk about facilitation here, about making sure that the day works, and then also taking a lead role on the day. But I like the sound of my own voice a bit, and I think there are better facilitators out there that let other people do the work, more of the work, for their own development. And they're there more as a coach and more there as a support to make sure that the day goes well and to step in when needed. But whatever it is, you need to know who have you got involved and who is doing what. Need a strategy based on what we know about the people. How do we win? How do we get to the point where we have got to the end of the workshop with what we want to achieve? And we need to know the outputs. What is the plan to capture the outputs? What are we going to use them for? Not only does that need to be in the next step bit, if nothing else, so people know why their day was useful or session was useful. You do need a plan as to physically what are you going to do with anything that comes out of it. Who's going to write it up? What are you going to do with the post-it notes on the sheets of paper immediately after the session, so that we definitely collect it and we don't lose anything? Is that going to be captured by the table facilitators? Is it going to be captured by somebody who's responsible for it? You need to know that in advance, because those people may need to get involved on the day to make sure they get what they need out of it. So vitally important you think about preparation, and we've not even got to the session yet. Who is going to be in the room? Well, you could have a lot of people in the room, a lot of people. So at the bottom there it says, these are people that could be in it. Clinicians of various different types and different numbers, different teams. You could have all sorts of different clinicians in a room. You can have all sorts of different expert social care deliverers of various different types. You can have managers of any type, patients, service users of any groups, volunteers, carers, commissioners, education providers. The unions should be there, or staff side representatives, third sector providers, ICS leads, private providers, local authority, primary care, HR, estates, finance, IT, all the experts, transformation leads, arm's length like NHS, EI, IE, Health Education England, etc., etc., etc. There are lots of other people that you can have in the room. When deciding who you're going to have in the room, you need to think, how many do I need? You need to think about how many workshops will I do this over? Will I have patients in the first ones but not in subsequent ones? Will I have them in all of them? Will I have a small group and then a large group? There's all those things to think about, but the who is very, very important here. Various things to consider. Experts. So what experts do you need in the room that know stuff that you need to know? So people that know about the current state might be needed, those that know what the plan is for the future state, so that you can ask them questions. If locations are going to be important, you need estates in the room. Who are the experts that you might need to call upon? They're going to be key. And then at the sort of bottom, who are the stakeholders that need to be in that room? Who are the ones with credibility? Who are the ones that are best placed to be able to do the redesign or be in the room for whatever reason, but also the ones that can bring the rest of their colleagues along? There's not much point having a workshop to agree the way forward if Amina is the most important person, important clinician going, and she has been kept out of the session, and she won't support anything that comes out of the session. You need to make sure that you have the right stakeholders in the room. So those are sort of bookending of it. The other things you need to think about are diversity. So if you think about the Equality Act of 2010, there are lots of different aspects of equality. So you need to consider not just race, not just gender or sexual orientation. You need to think about a whole range of things: age, disability, gender reassignment, marital status, pregnancy, motherhood. Have I said faith? There's a whole range of different things that you may or may not need to take into account. You need to make sure you are reflecting the diversity of your workforce, the diversity of your service users, and the diversity you want in your workforce, or more likely the diversity you should want in your workforce. So it's about making sure you've got a representative bunch of people there, and that's not easy all the time. You need to think about care providers and how do you bring in the right number of those, because there can be lots of them. Ambulance trusts, do you want them at every single one because they're covering lots of different areas? Same with mental health trusts and care trusts. Do you want all GPs in the room or a representative sample? If so, how do you get a representative sample without upsetting all the others? Can be quite complicated, that. Health is very fractured. We have a lot of different organisations. The same can be said for care homes. How do you get the right care homes involved in a conversation? And that then plays also into the private providers point there, because you may, if you're bringing private providers into the discussion, how do you bring them in? Commercially, how do you bring them in? how do you bring in the representative ones? How do you keep that fair? That can be quite complicated. So these are all things to either sort through or challenge your steering group with. The other one is service users, and this is another one. Service users, patients, volunteers, carers. How do you bring them into a conversation? Because in my experience, people don't always like to bring in patients because they want to have a closed door conversation. But service users add something to it, as long as you get the right service users. If you get someone who is advocating for a single issue, then they might try and drive that single issue, and that might not be what you want, or it might deflect from the wider objectives you're trying to achieve, and you might ignore all the other issues that patients have. So how do you find a representative group? That might be you get a patient group involved, like Healthwatch. I work with Healthwatch in Sheffield to do a few workshops, and they are blooming marvellous, and I would have them represented in everyone, and they always bring a range of patients to the table for the right situations, which is great. You can do all sorts of other things though. You can arrange service user events on their own to have a conversation with them about their experiences, and then from there select people that can then come over into the workshop. There's all sorts of other things you can do. I've worked with some great providers that run really good sessions with service users and staff together to really get them to understand each other, and bringing them in the right time is great. So obviously quite often what happens is people just pick who they think should be there, or who's available. It's best done if you think about it in advance. Phew, we are now pretty much getting into the session at long last. But this is the agenda which we're sending out in advance, and this is the way we might pace the day. So my agenda, my basic agenda, tends to be on the left-hand side. So I always start with welcome and introductions. Talk about avoiding the obvious in a bit. I always introduce some sort of background. What I like to do is have a patient view, if possible, but also have the sponsor view there, and people really bringing out why we are doing this, and really getting that in. What I then like to do is to present some stuff that we've got. Generally like to present some either the issues that we're trying to address based on work we've done before, or the baseline, the current state, etc., that we're trying to address, plus the challenge in terms of, this is what the staffing numbers are going to be like in 10 years if we don't do anything, kind of thing. So I like to get that down on the table. Now that might be sort of chalk and talk, as in just presenting it, but it normally starts with a bit of chalk and talk, and then people building on that in groups. We then move on to identifying the solutions, prioritising those solutions, and then a degree of action planning, next steps planning. So that's my basic agenda. Now it's quite light. It starts with a degree of chat, gets into some difficult conversations about what the issues are, and then we solve those issues and prioritise those issues. And what it describes, if you think of things in terms of an energy or a kind of enthusiasm kind of a way, is a bit of an arc that I like to call the Hollywood arc. And this is based on the sort of films I like to watch. I'm fairly mindless and like any sort of general Hollywood blockbuster type stuff. And your general Hollywood blockbuster, let us talk about something such as Avengers. We'll start with some general nice stuff going on, general bit of activity, a bit of a fighting going on, all good. Anyone generally happy, and then the heroes will get into peril. The Hulk will have disappeared off into the distance. Phil Coulson will have been unfortunately killed or not killed, depending on whether you follow the adventures on the TV in S.H.I.E.L.D. And it's all looking pretty bad. The aliens are attacking. New York is doomed. The world is doomed, etc. And then what happens is that the heroes suit up. They beat the bad guys up, rescue the day. Everyone is happy, and they all go off and have some shawarma. So it's all good. And so that is how you should run a workshop. Having gone into the film Avengers a little bit too much for most people, the way it works is you start off with some nice stuff, welcome and introduction, strengths, and a bit of a view, and then you get into the hard issues, and then you steadily solve those issues, You prioritize those, what you're doing, and then you are action planning at the end, proving it's all possible, and everyone leaves the cinema whistling. That is how I run most workshops, assuming that we want to get to the end with people being generally happy and generally ready for the next workshop. You can do it differently though. There's other things you can do. You can add at the end of it, you can add detailed action planning. You could add some really detailed work around who's in charge and identifying who's going to pick up each area. The trouble with that, and the trouble with going too far, is that you can lose the energy in the room, and the Hollywood arc will drop off again at the end, and people will leave it remembering that nobody wanted to put their hand up to deliver, to do the next bit. What you probably want to do is have another workshop where you start by setting out what you had agreed, and everyone discusses that first, before you then get into the low energy stuff of choosing who's going to be in charge of stuff, and then you do the action planning off the back end of it. To be honest though, I'd rather do choosing who's going to be doing stuff out of a workshop, because otherwise you're just going to end up with people who get frustrated with the lack of people putting their hands up, and maybe don't get the right people involved. The other thing you can introduce is an icebreaker. Now, icebreakers are pretty cool at times. They can also be very dangerous. When I'm doing training sessions with people over a week, when we're all in hotels, I will typically start with an icebreaker because I've got loads of time and because I've got a group that I want to start bonding. If I've got a 1 hour workshop, I'm not going to spend time on an icebreaker. If I do run an icebreaker, there are various books on icebreakers. You can look them up on the internet to see which ones you want to do. Not everyone likes them, but if you are going to do one, do a safe one. Don't do anything that's too mad, and you should be okay. What I do like to do though to start a workshop is to do the welcome and introductions, and that is very much about not to get people to go around and do the creeping death thing where you say I'm Colin and this is me, and I'm Jeff and this is me, and I'm Fiona, this is me. What you want is a bit more energy. So what I tend to do is, if I've got tables, is I'll get those tables talking and introducing themselves to each other, finding out about each other, and maybe finding out one thing they've got in common or something interesting about that table. That means that individuals don't need to find anything interesting about themselves if they hate this sort of thing. But the extroverts will come up with a few bits, and then those tables can then report back on who's around the table and what's interesting about that table. And that can often generate a degree of banter and a bit of energy if you're comfortable with that kind of thing. So always worth doing that. And I always have a welcome and introductions. Otherwise, I'm starting without the energy, and I like starting with a bit of energy. Hollywood arc again. Right, so having covered the agenda in quite a lot of detail and the film Avengers in probably too much, let's move on to a few things you might need to know within a workshop. So one thing you might need to do is to come up with solutions, which you might do through brainstorming. You might not though, because you might come up with solutions more just based on good practice or whatever else. But brainstorming, or at least people getting some views in, is a good technique to know, and it's something which you should consider all the time. So there's a few things you can do. One thing you can do is get a list of ideas. It's the simplest way of doing it. It's the way I always like to do it. I mean, if I'm working on a cost reduction piece of work, for example, I'll just go around and ask everybody, one-to-one, what issues do you have? Where do you think you could save money? And people know stuff. It's the whole thing of consultants, take your watch and tell you the time. But you can learn a lot just by listening to people. But in a workshop, you might want to do it online. You might want to use a tool like Mentimeter or any other sort of tool like that, and get people to start putting ideas down. You might want to get people to come up with a list of issues or ideas for solutions. And you might want to try a round robin. What you do with a round robin is where you go around a group and you ask people individually, have you got an idea? Great, get that idea written down, move on to the next person. You keep going round until everyone's run out of ideas. That's quite nice because you stop just one person from talking all the time, and people have to listen to each other, so that's quite nice. You can do that in all sorts of different ways. You can do it in plenary, so you can have a big group of 20 people and you say, right, shout out issues, You can do it in a group, so you can break down into tables, it's the one I like because you get a bit of banter and a bit of individual views. Or you can just ask individuals to do it as well. And so you say to them, right, shout out, individuals. You say to them, work on your own and come up with a list yourself, and then report back to the group, kind of thing. So these are all good ideas for brainstorming. There's also other ways you can do it. You can approach it from different viewpoints. So you can say, right, let's have a look at this and think, what's the worst way you could do this? Let's think about this as the worst. Let's think about the best. What's the best, the best process we could have? If money was no object and staff was no object, what would the best process be? Yeah. But if we were deliberately going out of a way to make it the worst process, what would it look like? And people can do stuff like, there would be no reception, from which we'd identify the reception might be a good idea or whatever. We can see it from a different person's viewpoint. So think, what would the view be of an executive person? What would the view be of a patient? What would the view be of a carer? What would the view be of a nurse? What would the view be of... you can do this from historic figures. What would Socrates think of this? If you really want to get into some slightly interesting ways of doing it, there's all sorts of different approaches like that. And finally, thinking of it from a different company. So how would Apple approach this? How would Disney approach this? Are quite typical ones. Obviously, that means you want to be large corporates in that case. How might a corner shop operation think of this? Think of it from a different viewpoint. So those are other ways of brainstorming. Another one is you can use Edward de Bono's 6 hats. It's not actually supposed to be quite used as a brainstorming approach, but it's quite a good one. Because you can look at things in terms of, right, can we introduce new ideas? Can we think of it from a very positive viewpoint? Can we think of it from a negative viewpoint? Can we think of it from a feelings point of view? Can we think of it from a facts point of view? What do the facts tell us? What do our feelings tell us? If I'm thinking about this positively or negatively. If I'm thinking of this as a big picture strategically, you can wear different coloured hats if you wish, or metaphorically wear different coloured hats to think about things in a different way. If you've got a particularly negative person, getting them to think positively can be amusing, if nothing else. And then there are a whole host of different complex ways of doing brainstorming. The step ladder approach. I'm not going to go into detail. There are loads of them. If you want a complicated one, fine. I never use them. Key ones for me, the list of ideas. I like the approach from different viewpoints, and I sometimes use Edward de Bono's 6 hats as a mechanism for brainstorming. Right, so that's brainstorming. Now, if you are coming up with ideas and a solution or a future state or whatever, then you've got to realise that you are not going to get a completely necessary degree of consensus. So if someone comes up with an idea, not everybody's going to agree with it, and you're not necessarily going to be able to come up with an idea that everyone does agree with. There's going to be arguments. If you say, I want this to do this, people will go, no, I think that's a stupid idea, we tried that, whatever, it didn't work, or whatever. And you can end up with a lack of consensus. There are different degrees of consensus that you can end up with on the scale there. So you can end up with complete consensus. Everybody agrees the same. There are certain, I've heard tell, and I could be wrong, of certain communities that operate entirely on consensus, and they don't do anything unless everybody agrees, and they take the time to think it through. If you've got lots of time and you think you can get to that stage, great. So you might have complete consensus. You might have a majority decision, as in you've identified a couple of versions and the majority have decided that they want to go, or they think the future state should look in a certain way. But you might end up with a couple of dissenters, in which case that is a majority decision. You have voted and you have decided on that. You might end up with a consultative decision where somebody in charge has asked everyone's views and has made a decision on the basis of that. You might have a minority decision, which is basically where some people can decide on something and the others can't decide on anything. So it can be a minority decision. And I guess the worst case is that people agree that there is no decision. And that is in reality where people cannot make a decision, and we actually record the fact that we are not making a decision. That in reality means that either nobody is making a decision, or that you don't want to move ahead with anything at this point because you have not yet decided. So the degree of consensus, you cannot get everybody to agree. I used to stress like crazy in workshops, especially system workshops, about getting consensus amongst clinicians. I mean, there are some where you cannot get those, because if one believes one, the other person will believe the other, and if you get one convinced, the other one will just change their mind. It just becomes too difficult. So you want to get as much consensus, I guess, as you can, but bear in mind that any of those are results that you may get out, and it's not down to you necessarily whether you get them or not. How can you build consensus, though? I mean, there are a few things in terms of what drives these things. What drives consensus? I can't remember where I got this from, but there are a few things that do drive consensus. One is enough time to really think something through. That's clear, so thought. Trust amongst the participants, that things will get done the way you think it's going to get done, and not misrepresented later on. So this is quite common in the NHS, where people say if we write it down, then people will hold us to it. I'm not sure who those people are or how they magically hold them to that when they don't. I can't hold them to anything else, but that is a fear. So trust is important. The chance to explore and to discuss it as a group in an open way, and really think it through and just understand it, and try out some what ifs, and then support, mutual support amongst people to make it work properly afterwards. People want to know how are they going to cope with this stuff, and a key part of this is make sure you've got the appropriate support. Another key thing to think about from a degree of consensus is the fact that you can't see this as a single workshop. You need to see it as a chance to talk and engage to start with, and then have a workshop, and then document it, have another workshop, document it, and in between talk and engage with people. Find out what people's what challenges are, maybe do some more analysis to help with the thought stuff, maybe get some more exploration going on, maybe address trust issues and support issues in between, and come back to the next workshop. Each time documenting where you are so you don't lose stuff. So those are sort of a key way of doing things. What you might decide to do is to vote on something. And if you are going to vote on something, then I've done voting really badly, and a few times, even recently. Voting can be really problematic. If I do voting, I do not like to do voting on the fly, but often you have to. Okay, so I'd like to do voting in a second workshop if I can, or offline afterwards. But assuming people want to get to a prioritized set of things, or a top things that we're going to work on, or an agreement around one thing, you need to do the voting. If you're going to do that, you need to write down the questions really clearly. What exactly are we voting on? And that's why I don't like doing it in the workshop, because it's very difficult to clearly write down the options in a way that is completely understandable to everybody. But if you're going to do it, make the voting as clear as possible so people know what they're voting for. And the other thing I like to do is to do multi-stage voting if I can. So not just... if you can start with, might start with a list of 10 or a list of 20. Give everybody a chance to vote for 1 to 5 or whatever, or give everybody 3 stickers they can use, or give everyone 100 points they can distill between the options. However you want to do it, doesn't really matter. But once you've done it once, then thin down the list and do a second stage of voting. I like to do that because I think it then does, it drives out people's, a lot of voting that's happened around some of the sort of more minor issues, and allows you then to focus on some of the things that are going to be more important. So I like to try a couple of stages, a bit like some elections. So that's consensus, big topic, lots of stuff to talk about. So if you're in the workshop, though, I suppose when you're in some workshops, my fear as I go into them is that they're going to be difficult. And I think there's a few things, there's some skills you need if you're going to facilitate. You need to be able to listen a lot. You're not there to talk, you're there to listen. But when you are talking, you should be doing a few things. You should be summarizing. So you should summarize regularly. If you're talking, you should be summarizing. It should be about, okay, so what I've heard is this. We've heard 3 points. They are this, this, and this. Yeah, from a whole load of stuff that's happened. Okay, asking everybody, do we agree? Yeah, you should be questioning. If people are saying things, you should be either asking the difficult questions or getting other people to ask the difficult questions. What do you mean by that? I don't quite understand. Can you elaborate around some of these things? Ask the stupid questions, so that we really get out get to the root of what people are saying. You should be appreciating. You should be thanking people. In fact, one of the tactics you have got for difficult people in a workshop is to not thank them at all. I once worked for a boss who used that to devastating effect at a meeting that I was at, and it is sometimes it's a greater tool than being aggressive or difficult with aggressive or difficult people. But you really should be appreciating as many people as possible. People are giving up their time, they're coming up with good stuff. It's easy to think about issues. You should be appreciating, you should be thanking, and you should be reflecting back on who said stuff, and providing that feedback a lot. The other thing you should be doing, either verbally or non-verbally, is intervening to deal with behaviours. We'll call them bad behaviours, but they could also be just behaviours. So intervening to deal with people that are not, you think want to speak but aren't able to speak, etc., as well as difficult people. So there's a number of different skills you need. It's worth thinking about these as you go into things. Listening, summarising, questioning, appreciating and intervening. So, facilitation of those behaviours. So, behaviours, when we talk about behaviours, we often talk about bad behaviour, but there is no such thing really as bad behaviour. They're just behaviours. Yeah, it's an interesting area that you want those behaviours to help you towards your goal. So, I guess bad behaviour is anything which diverts us from the goal that we all want to achieve and all agreed that we are going to achieve. So there's a few things to think about. First of all, make sure the room is right. You want the room to be non-threatening where possible. You want the room to be rewarding at times. So if they're difficult, you want to find a nice room for people with lots of light. I like rooms which are not too packed, but I don't like rooms that are too quiet. So you can't have a dance hall with 3 tables in it, but you can't have a large workshop where people are crammed in and can't sit and it gets hot. So yeah, behaviours, you need to make sure the room is the right size. You need to make sure the room is the right temperature, the right amount of windows, etc. Is rewarding, hopefully, for people without being ostentatious. Off-site is quite helpful because that's less threatening. If you think your manager's going to walk in or whatever, you might feel better off-site. You might feel better if you're not dressed in your uniform or your suit or whatever. These are all things to think about in terms of facilitation. Very difficult to get the room right because quite typically, I know I've done loads of workshops for system redesign where I've expected 100 people on average between 10 and 20% of people drop out and you suddenly end up with empty tables. It's not an easy thing to get right, but that's it. You need to make sure that everyone knows what we are doing. Okay, so if you want to get behaviours right, people need to know and agree that the objective is right, that they're here to achieve something. They need to agree that they're there to achieve that objective. If they're not there to achieve that objective, then they shouldn't be in the room. And if you can get them to agree to it, it is something that you can hold them to account for if there is behaviour which is not helping us towards that objective. They also need to agree with the approach. So the amount of people that really get annoyed by the process is there's always people saying, I wonder if we could change things around. There's always somebody that will say, perhaps we could do this differently. And you go, no. You need to agree the method or tell people what the method is you're using. Tell them you've thought about it. Okay. Now, if you want to change it, fine. Okay. But changing it means it's a bit like completely changing a team mid-flow in a sports game. It upsets everybody. So make sure everyone knows what they're doing in advance. They agree the process and they agree the objective. What we want to do is to make sure that everyone is heard, to make sure that there is good listening as you go through it. We talk about listening, and you want to make sure you are aiming to reach consensus, or as I say, a view on how much consensus there is. But facilitation of behaviours, you want to make sure that everyone is heard, and you want to make sure that everyone is heard. Yeah, good listening, not everyone talks, really is ignored and then moves on. Okay, and you want to get to the point where you are driving towards reaching consensus, if that's part of the objectives, and it's possible within the workshop, because that's what they want to get out of it. You want to make sure you handle disagreement well, and we'll talk about conflict in a second. you want to make sure that you are creating, you're bringing out the best in terms of creativity and innovation where you can. Really trying to build on that innovation and creativity, not shutting that down. And you want to think about, how do I build the high energy groups? That's what you want. If you can get a group that's got high energy, is really up for this, rather than being upset they're in the room, then you have done a good job. There are some interesting behaviours that you can have, that you might want to address. So in terms of the approaches that you can use, there's all sorts of different approaches that you can use. So you can propose things when you're talking. You can say, what about this? What about that? You can build on something somebody has said. You can support what somebody has said, okay? And other people can support on them. They can disagree with what people have said, and that's all fine, yeah? You can discuss what people have said, yeah? You can agree with what people have said. You can summarize what people have said. You can make decisions. You can introduce new ideas, and you can test ideas. These are all things which are okay. And you, but hopefully everybody in the room, are using those sorts of behaviours. But other things or approaches, things that might happen is you might end up with people that are rambling. You might end up with people that are deliberately argumentative. They're not disagreeing, they're arguing in a way which is trying to basically convince people over to their side just by force of argument, not because of the underlying facts. You find people that are dominating people or shutting out people. You can find people that have side conversations, which is one of my least favourite, especially when they start laughing. You can have inarticulate people who want to say something but can't say it, and you can have people that are just plain wrong but introduce things as if they're facts when they are not. So those behaviours are things you can do. What can you do about those? Well, there's all sorts of different things you can do. You can realise that they are behaviours you do not want to see. So as well as being nice about people doing the behaviours on the left-hand side, the different approaches, you can name that. You can name that. Well, first of all, you can notice those behaviours. And when you note those behaviours, you can name those behaviours. Okay, so you can, where required, you can say to people, I've noticed you're having a side conversation. It'll be helpful if we don't have a side conversation. Or I noticed you're having a side conversation. Could you share that with the group if you want to be a bit school teachery? But there's a reason why you can name these things, and that can be enough in its own right. Firm but friendly confrontation being the key there. Okay, in these things. One thing you can do with a lot of things, and again, the school teachers will recognise this one, is have a private discussion. So if somebody is being difficult in any of those behaviours, if they are being rambling, argumentative, if they are wrong, etc., you can take them to one side and let them know, say name it, let them know that it's disruptive, and be very, very specific. In terms of giving that feedback, obviously in those particular cases, it's generally the feedback sandwich. It's what's good about what they've done so far. It's been really good you've done this. Yeah. However, you are being, I've noticed you're being dominating because this example, it's not helpful. Hopefully we can get back on board and have a good workshop type thing. If you can make sure you mix the positive with the negative, then that will always help. There are various other things you can do there which are slightly less scary than taking people aside for a private discussion. You can use non-verbal signals. The one for me, the biggest problem you face, ironically for me, because I tend to do it, is rambling. So people that are just talking a lot and a lot and a lot. If people are talking a lot and a lot and a lot, just steadily moving closer and closer to them, so they catch you in your eye line, nodding, and then steadily getting closer and closer and closer, and if you then need to, then interrupt. But you can do a lot of stuff through non-verbal signals. If you've got presenters that are going over and they can catch them in the timeline and you can touch your watch, well, they should generally get the view from that. So there's all those things to deal with. You've got to remember, though, as I say, there's no such thing necessarily as bad behaviour. Each person in that room is going through something, and people have got their own ways of looking at things. But my boss always, when I was at Finham, always used to say there are three things that you need to understand. Why change? What's in it for me? And how will I cope? That's what people are interested in. And in this particular case, what's in it for them and how will they cope might not be known. And there is also a power shift. Okay, power is changing. It might be in a small room, it might be in a large organization or between organizations, but power is changing. And when power shifts, you end up with difficulty and conflict if you're not careful. So be aware of it and be prepared to address it. So I've ended on a bit of a low there, haven't I, really, just to wreck my Hollywood arc, but I have talked you through how to actually address those difficult behaviours. And one thing you have to remember, he says, trying to bring it back upbeat, is that facilitation is an amazing skill to learn. It begins right the way back at permission and talking to the sponsor about what they're trying to get out of this and making sure you've got the support to do it. It gets into engagement and talking to people in advance. You're planning and preparing, you're running the session, dealing with conflict, getting the brainstorming out, etc. And then post-session, you can always think about feedback. Always good to get feedback from people if you can. But you're going to be writing up that stuff and getting it out to people and maybe running other sessions. So that's a fairly quick run through of facilitation. Lots more on this on the internet if you really want to get into facilitation. But hopefully that is enough to help you think about how you might run a future state workshop and the approach you might take to that. Next steps in the best tradition of these courses. If you want to, you can register to the WRaPT tool. You may buy the Bumper Book of Health and Care Workforce Planning from Amazon from the end of June 2021. You can visit the WRaPT website. You can visit the Health Education England Workforce Planning pages. You can visit the Carados website and you can email me from there. Please like, subscribe, ding the bell, comment on these things. I don't know what dinging the bell is, but people tend to say it. And please continue the WRaPT redesign course either with modelling or with any of the other courses if you are coming at this at a different angle. Please start the WRaPT Hub course, the WRaPT Plan course, or the WRaPT Frontline courses. Those are a whole lot shorter than this gigantic WRaPT redesign course. Thanks all for your time. Have a great day.